Product provided for review. Thanks, WayForward. In the not too distant future, humanity faces a food shortage due to overpopulation and solar flares. To combat the impending famine, InGest Corporation genetically engineers a new food supply. Spidersaurs. Half spider, half dinosaur. Spidersaurs are the food of the future. Unfortunately for InGest, the Spidersaurs have escaped containment and are rampaging through the facility. Now it's up to police cadet Adrian and rocker girl Victoria to team up to stop them. Thus is the plot of Spidersaurs, WayForward's newest run-and-gun action platformer. Originally released for Apple Arcade in 2019, Spidersaurs now makes its way to Nintendo Switch with new features and rebalanced gameplay. The gameplay of Spidersaurs is fairly simple. Players are tasked with running, jumping, and gunning their way to the end of each course and defeating whatever crazed, chitinous, cretaceous creature serves as the stage's boss. Overall, the game has a very arcadey feel. Hold up. This is Contra. This is Contra, right? I've never played Contra. Oh boy, this is gonna be one of those games that's catered to a very specific audience that I'm not a part of, isn't it? Well, whatever. If it's a good game, it shouldn't. Wait a second. The meat and potatoes of Spidersaurs is its platforming and shooting. The game handles well with tight, responsive controls. The character's run speed can feel a little slow at times, especially when trying to get out of the way of incoming projectiles, but players will receive additional movement options to help them dodge shortly into the game. After each course, the game's protagonists receive new abilities, such as the ability to climb walls and ceilings or a double jump. Unfortunately, Spidersaurs dedicates only a single text box explaining how each power works. These half-baked tutorials give no context for how and when to use each ability. More often than not, I plumb forgot I even had new abilities as soon as I got them, and courses are designed with the expectation that players will know when and where to use each power. Variety is the spice of life, and to that end, Spidersaurs features a wealth of weapons. During the course of gameplay, players will find several weapon pickups and can carry and freely switch between two of them. If that wasn't enough to sate your appetite for dino destruction, each of the game's two protagonists have their own variation on the game's guns. This adds a nice layer of strategy. Players will have to decide which weapons complement not only each other, but also their character. Unfortunately, while they appreciate the game's weapon variety, the weapons themselves feel puny. I blame the weak sauce sound design for each weapon. Alternatively, the weapons may have felt weak because I wasn't taking advantage of the upgrade system. Collecting a weapon the player is already carrying will upgrade that weapon to be more powerful. While cool in concept, this doesn't come into play very often for a couple of reasons. First, weapons aren't so plentiful that the player will likely be able to hold on to one long enough to encounter a second one of the same type. Secondly, players lose their currently held weapon every time they get their goose cooked. And last of all, getting hit downgrades a player's weapon by one level, so even if they can get one, they're not likely to hang on to it for long. I have a beef with this mechanic. It just seems petty. If a player can get to the end of a stage without getting hit, do they really need the game to be easier? Bosses can eat a lot of lead before dropping too. Fighting with a powered down arsenal is often a recipe for disaster. And that leads me to the meat of my criticism for Spidersaurs. Clearing courses is oftentimes very tedious. Stages only have one checkpoint, which means getting a game over while fighting the level's boss will require the player to replay half the stage, and these are not short stages. Between that, the weapon downgrading system, and the fact that players can only take 3 hits before they're toast, Spidersaurs is very punishing to the careless. I also found it difficult to keep track of everything happening on screen. Bosses will often launch multiple attacks at a time from multiple parts of the screen, which makes it all too easy to lose track of where everything is. Likewise, enemies will try to shoot players in the back from off screen if left alive, thus oftentimes sandwiching the player between two fronts. Admittedly, this likely won't be an issue for everyone, as I tend to be pretty easy to overwhelm. All of this is to say that the game inadvertently encourages a very conservative playstyle. For most of the game's courses, I would end up replaying each stage until I had it memorized, then inch through it to avoid biting off more than I can chew, all in hopes of conserving my lives and weapons for the level's boss. Because of this, my first run of this game ended up being a stressful, tedious slog. Yes, I did say first run. After beating the game on medium difficulty, I played the game a second time on the well done difficulty, which is what the game calls easy mode, despite the fact that well done meat is typically tougher. Because Spidersaurs borrows heavily from Contra, a series known for its difficulty, I suspected my dissatisfaction simply boiled down to my unfamiliarity with the gameplay conventions of the series Spidersaurs was emulating. And in large part, I was correct. My second playthrough of Spidersaurs was far more enjoyable, if not a little too much of a cakewalk. The game's difficulty levels are surprisingly comprehensive in their approach. Not only does it decrease how many shots each enemy can eat before perishing, well done mode also removes the stupid weapon downgrading mechanic. But I can't recommend playing the game on easy. While I think it's a more balanced and enjoyable experience, especially to more casual players, the final boss and true ending are only available on the medium and rare difficulties, a discovery that left a bitter taste in my mouth. Also, Spidersaurs is short. My first playthrough only took a few hours, and my easy mode playthrough just over 1 hour. For an arcade-style game such as this, that can be quite a benefit, as it can make it more replayable. For instance, I can't tell you how many times I've replayed Star Fox 64. Moreover, the game includes an unlockable arcade mode for those who'd like to skip the lengthy dialogue sequences and jump right into the action. That said, that's all contingent on whether or not one would like to come back to this game every now and then. Me personally, I've had my fill. Like most WayForward games, Spidersaurs features smooth and lively 2D animation. Unfortunately, much like Shantae and the Seven Sirens, the game's viewpoint is pulled so far back that I wasn't able to appreciate any of the animation. The environmental art is likewise well drawn, but doesn't really stand out. It's merely functional. This isn't helped by the title's utterly bland course themes: lab, jungle, volcano, sewer, basically everything you would expect from a game about mutant dinosaurs. Overall, Spidersaurs fares much better in terms of audio. The game's soundtrack is a feast for the ears, full of musical pieces covering a range of styles and moods. At the time of the game's initial release in 2019, Spidersaurs was the first game the composer Hirumi Fujita had composed for in 20 years. All I have to say to that is, Ms. Fujita, you've still got it. My only issue with the game's music is that it doesn't appear to be for sale anywhere. Please get on that, WayForward. Most of the game's story sequences are fully voiced, something that not even Shantae and the Seven Sirens composed. The voice acting is pretty much perfect, especially for a campy game inspired by Saturday morning cartoons. Not only is the voice acting good, but each character's voice matches them exquisitely. I knew what each character was about the second they opened their mouth. The writing is lighthearted and humorous, as to be expected from a WayForward game. It does seem to be lacking the sardonic bite of other WayForward titles like Shantae and River City Girls, but I think it works. I especially appreciate that Spidersaurs doesn't paint InGest as villains. None of the researchers, with one obvious exception, are evil or even particularly greedy. Just short-sighted, naive, and perhaps a smidge incompetent. Spidersaurs' story isn't deep, nor does it include any real surprises. It is, however, charming. That said, the dialogue sequences can go on for quite some time, which is a little out of place for an arcade shooter. Also, one of the bosses in the game is a robot from a rival company, and it's implied its presence is an act of corporate sabotage, but the game never follows up on it. It just doesn't come up again. In the end, I really want to like Spidersaurs. It's a fun, campy concept, and the gameplay is built on a solid foundation. Moreover, I'm fairly certain many of the design decisions I take issue with are meant to infuse the game with that old-school Contra flavor. But I'm not a Contra fan, so the game's attempts at old-school difficulty ultimately just serve to slow the pace of the game to that of cold molasses. Unfortunately, this game just doesn't suit my tastes. For that reason, I have to give Spidersaurs a shrug. This game is available for $20. Unfortunately, it's also quite short, making the price hard to justify, especially if you only intend to play it once. If you're interested, I definitely recommend that you wait for it to go on sale. Okay, but seriously, what was InGest's plan? Spidersaurs have to eat too, and they're not exactly small. Where's their feed going to come from if all the crops have failed?